We're meeting in a country at war, a war of choice, and at a time when the Canadian Prime Minister famously reminded us at Davos that there's been a rupture in the global order, the global supposedly rules-based order. But 65 years ago, it could also feel like there was a rupture in the United Nations of the 1960s. What you described is very fragile, the UN that you described, with real questions about whether it's going to survive or not. That UN was just over 15 years old. It had had a first Secretary General who was a Norwegian male. It had a second Secretary General who was a Swedish male. There were some people who thought that a third Nordic as Secretary General would be a fine thing, too. Instead, we have your grandfather, U Thant, who had been a school teacher in a small backwater town in Burma, as you say, until he was nearly 40. In 1948, he became a senior civil servant in Rangoon. In 1957, Burmese ambassador to the UN. And in 1961, UN Secretary General. The world was changing, and sometimes it feels like U Thant was an avatar of that change. Tell us about what was happening inside and outside the UN that sort of sets the stage for his ascent.
Yeah, no, first thank you very much, Karin, and I'm really grateful to the Ford Foundation with its long history of work with the UN and support for the UN. So thank you very much, Otto, for your kind remarks, and it's great to be here. Karin, with everyone, as Otto said, on this sunny day outside, to be in this auditorium talking about UN history and the future of the UN as well. I think the thing maybe to think about first is that the first UN reform ideas go back to 1946. So even when the UN was just 1 year old, people were saying it was no longer fit for purpose. And the original conception of the UN in 1943, 44, by the Americans, but to some extent by the Soviets and the British as well, was for this very muscular continuation of the wartime alliance, to enforce the peace after World War II, to keep the Germans and the Japanese down forever, and to make sure that there was no new aggressors on the scene. But then came a whole series of different compromises which led to the UN architecture that we have today in the Charter. But with the unfolding of the Cold War, it was really unclear how this was going to work. And in the late 40s and early 50s, the Americans were very dominant in the UN. But still, the Soviets played along, the others played along as well. But then a couple of things happened by the late 1950s. I think the first is that Dag Hammarskjöld, as UN Secretary General, understood that even in the middle of the Cold War, with the big powers at each other's throats in the Security Council as well as outside in Europe, that there was a role for the Secretary General to play as mediator. And this wasn't something that was ordained in the Charter, but he crafted this role out of the historical moment that he was in. But the much more important thing that happened in the late 1950s was decolonization. And maybe decolonization is too passive a word, because when we say decolonization, it seems like it's something that was granted to these countries. Whereas in fact, these countries fought for their independence, many of them in bloody struggles over many decades, in India, in Africa, and elsewhere. And I think when we sit here in the US or in Europe, the history of the world seems like, the history of the 20th century world, seems like the history of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, post-Cold War. But most of the world, the history of the 20th century is the history of empire and the fight against empire and the transition to a different world. And I think that late 1950s moment when Thant became ambassador to the UN was a moment of great ambition by these countries that had successfully fought against empire. And I think what they understood more than anything else was that if they wanted to have a peaceful world, that had to also be a world without empire. And a world without empire also meant a world in which the global economic system and much else was also transformed. So they saw all these things as interconnected. They understood also in 1961 with the Russians and the Americans on the verge of a nuclear standoff, that they had to intervene to save the day. That if they, in what we now call the global south, left it to the global north, the world would be destroyed. That they had to mobilize these countries with this ambition for a more peaceful world, had to come together, use the UN to make sure that we didn't have World War III. And they wanted one of their own to head the UN. And so when Dag Hammarskjöld was killed, and now we know that he was certainly killed in the plane crash in what was then northern Rhodesia, it was a moment when people thought maybe the UN won't survive for a few more months or even a few more weeks, but then they came to an agreement on this at that time, and he was just a little more than a decade away from being a school teacher in a small town, and all of a sudden he was acting UN Secretary General at the height of the Cold War, at the beginning of this monumental phase of transition in global politics from the age of empire to the age after.
It was a pivotal moment, and we're going to talk more about that nuclear standoff in a moment. But he also brought, it was really striking from the book, he was so driven and he was visionary as Secretary General. You're right, for example, that Thant felt he had to insert himself into the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in a way that would not exceed his authority and scupper a role in future diplomacy. He was also conscious that his predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, had never tried to mediate between the superpowers. So these were uncharted waters, as you say. Thant was quick to propose himself, his personal mediation, in several conflicts, and he also did his homework. He wasn't lumbering out there blindly. I think the other thing that's very striking is the way people reached out to him, not just politicians, which you'll say more about, but John Lennon, Yehudi Menuhin, Arthur Miller, Arnold Toynbee, the Dalai Lama, Frank Sinatra, Jacques Cousteau, the list goes on, Nobel laureates, of people who wanted to be associated with both with Thant personally and with the UN because of the message of peace. And in 1967, a Gallup poll in the US ranked U Thant the sixth most admired man in the world. But he'd been in office for less than 1 year when the Cuban Missile Crisis hit in October 1962. What did he do?
So, I think it's really important, this story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we all know a little bit about it. We learn about it in school and universities. You might have seen it in a movie. You might have seen it in different kind of documentaries and things. But in none of those movies or documentaries do you ever see a Burmese man mediating between the superpowers. And there's a reason for that, and there's a very deep reason for that in terms of why that's been airbrushed out of history. And I think in some ways it's very deliberate. It's not an accidental thing. But the way the story is normally told is that the Soviets put missiles in Cuba. Kennedy is very skillful, he's determined, he's quite tough, and eventually the Russians back down. It's not a story of compromise or mediation. I think what's important to understand in terms of his role was that he had no mandate. There was no General Assembly, there was no time for a General Assembly discussion, there was no time even for a Security Council discussion. And he knew, of course, and everyone knew that the Security Council would be deadlocked on this issue because it involved the two superpowers. So what he did when he first learned on television, together with the whole world, that President Kennedy had instituted a blockade of Cuba, and there were Soviet ships steaming towards the blockade line, and that could lead to a standoff, that he had not days but hours to intervene and find exactly the right way which he could be useful in the de-escalation of the conflict. And he understood it, and I think in the way that Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy also understood, was that this wasn't a military crisis, this was a political crisis, that both men had to find a way to step back from the brink and to prevent escalation and move towards de-escalation. So the question is, how do you use the moral authority of the UN to create those ladders of de-escalation for both sides? And so the day after, so Kennedy gives a speech in the evening on television. It's a big crisis around the world. The next day, he spends the entire day with his base, essentially. So in deep conversation, by telegram, in person, with countries like Ghana, India, Egypt, and others. And when he acted as UN Secretary General, but also as a representative of the non-aligned movement in the countries of Asia and Africa. That gave him the moral authority. So his moral authority was derived from the UN, but also as a representative of these countries that had embraced the UN and wanted to find a different way. So he sends a series of different public and private messages to Kennedy and Khrushchev. It's a complicated story over those days, but essentially both Khrushchev and Kennedy, in their different ways, used him, or used that insertion of the role of the Secretary General to find the space and the time they both needed to make the climb down. Kennedy used him in a different way as well. I've heard all the audio tapes from ExCom, which is Kennedy's group of top advisors that were meeting throughout the day over the weeks of the crisis. And at least on 3 occasions when his advisors were pushing him to invade Cuba immediately, and we now know that if they'd done that, that would almost certainly triggered a world war. Kennedy responds, we have to wait for Thant's diplomacy. So Kennedy also used him to push back against his own people to create that space and time. And very importantly, I think for U Thant, coming from a small country like Burma, he understood that this wasn't just about the 2 superpowers, it was a 3rd small country that was involved as well, and that was Cuba. And so he flies to Cuba, he meets with Fidel Castro, and through 2 days of discussion, wins over Castro's trust. And so when Castro himself also has to begin to find a path towards a peaceful settlement, he refers to U Thant, he uses U Thant as the point of reference. He doesn't respond to Khrushchev, he doesn't respond to Kennedy, certainly, he responds to U Thant. And it's the same with Khrushchev as well, where when he had to kind of pull back from the brink, it was much easier to say yes to a moral appeal from the UN Secretary General for peace than it was to an American ultimatum. So I think it was crafting that intervention at that time, and then also playing for the time that was necessary, because there was never any final agreement, there was no peace agreement on this, there was never any formal agreement, even on verification, but it was creating the time that diffused the situation and allowed everyone to pull back in their own way.
And he had personal relationships with Kennedy, with Khrushchev, with Castro, which again, read from today's perspective, I found quite remarkable. But I can confirm, having read through the long Wikipedia entry on the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there is not a single reference to U Thant. And I also read through the long Wikipedia entry on the Iran-Pakistan War of 1965, where there's also no reference to U Thant. And these are the 2 crises you can profile in the book as making it remarkable that U Thant is so absent from history. So what was his role in 1965 with India and with Pakistan?
So the India-Pakistan War began over Kashmir. There was fighting in Kashmir. India widened the front. Within a few weeks, by early September, it had become this tremendous war with, I think, almost 1 million men fighting on both sides. The biggest tank battle since World War II. It was a huge war that could bring in the Chinese, that might have brought in other powers, that could have led to a much broader confrontation as well. So Thant decided then that this wasn't something where he was going to appoint a special envoy or even have his deputy Ralph Bunche go, that he had to go himself. And so he flew with Brian Urquhart, who actually I met for the first time in this very building when he was a fellow in resident. Brian Urquhart, who was Thant's aide in the 1960s. So he and Brian, just 2 of them, actually with press aid, flew to Rawalpindi, spent many days with the Pakistani chief, General U Khan, and flew across the confrontation line to Delhi to meet with the Indian Prime Minister, but also others in the Indian government, Bahadur Shastri and others. And the key thing that he was trying to do in those conversations over those many days in both places was to establish that personal relationship with both men. And again, to use the moral authority of the UN, plus that set of relationships that he built up on the spot over those days. Because he couldn't, as UN Secretary General, miraculously end the war. And he couldn't go in and say, stop, and they would stop. He had to identify that right moment when they had both been fighting for a couple of weeks, when they were near a point of exhaustion, where maybe if left their own devices, they would have continued fighting in a war of attrition, or the war would have spread in some other way. The Chinese would have become involved, or or others would have become involved. He had to time it for exactly that right moment when the offer of a face-saving ladder towards peace was something that they were willing to accept. So he had to craft his role so that when they were both at least thinking about the possibility of a ceasefire, that everything was in place. And to put the moral authority of the UN again in that situation, in that dynamic, so that that was also there as an option. The UN option was there. And that wasn't simply, again, his relationship with these men, but it was everything that had been built up until that point as well, in terms of the UN as an institution, who was supporting him around the world, but also his personal diplomacy.
I want to come back to the question of airbrushing from history, though. I was reflecting that during the time I was a special representative of the Secretary General, it was understood that if there was an advance in negotiation or mediation, if there was a breakthrough, you would not take UN credit for that, much less me personally. It had to be owned by the parties. It was the sagacity of the parties that had brought us here, because after all, they did need to own it and implement it. And I wonder if there was some of that at work in why U Thant was not out front in claiming credit.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of layers. I mean, one layer is simply that, exactly what you said, that he was keen in some situation not to claim credit. I think that he was this first non-white head of the UN, and so for some, maybe there was an element of racism, there was other things as well that meant that they didn't want to give him the credit, or he just seemed like a character that really didn't fit in with that global diplomatic picture that had existed up until that time. I think a deeper story, though, is his story around Vietnam and around the Middle East. That I think if he had not begun to challenge publicly the Lyndon Johnson White House on Vietnam, and later become someone who was seen as a problem also for Israel in the context of the Middle East after 1967 in particular, he might have been someone to whom more credit was given than otherwise. I think there's that. But I think the deepest sort of reason why he was airbrushed was that he wasn't the only one who was airbrushed. That entire moment of the people who identify themselves in the UN as the Afro-Asian, the people who came from the newly decolonized countries, who transformed the UN in the late 50s and 60s, who made their agenda the agenda of the UN, that doesn't fit in, or didn't fit in the 1990s and after, with the narrative around the liberal international order. And when that narrative around the liberal international order was crafted in the 1990s, maybe even the 1980s onwards, this moment of how the UN was fundamentally shaped, transformed, shaped, reshaped, and incredibly successful, didn't fit in with that broader picture. So I think it's not just U Thant who disappeared, but that whole period in history of why the UN was set up, how it changed, how it was successful, I think is not part of our imagination of what global history was in the 1920s.
A rewriting of history.
Yeah.
I want to stay on his personality in a moment, because there's a fascinating picture of his personality in the book. Not just his patience and tenacity, which there's ample evidence of, but his occasional abrasiveness as well. He pushes back hard on member states who criticize him. He essentially walks out on the Soviet ambassador over Cuba and threatens to go over his head to Khrushchev if he needs to. He turns down the US Secretary of State who wants him to negotiate with Chombe over Qatar. President Nkrumah of Ghana criticizes him, and Thant says he takes exception to that. The New York Times called him blunt-spoken and tough acting. My favorite example, at a time when US President Barry Goldwater was calling for low-grade nuclear bombs over communist supply lines in the Vietnamese jungle, Thant said publicly that anybody who proposes the use of atomic weapons is out of his mind. But here he is doing these things at a time of phenomenal racism and discrimination Many Western politicians just could not accept that a small brown man, and I'm paraphrasing US and British racist disparagements of him at the time, had anything to offer them by way of insight or knowledge. And you note, and I was really taken by this, that U Thant had to manage a special version of himself, keeping up an image that those who had grown up in a white-only world could respect. I think today we might call this code switching. You do what you have to do to work in an environment that isn't your own. Jackie Kennedy, who was another big fan of his, referred to his rare quality of spirit. What was that quality?
I think that he placed an enormous amount of value in store in people's temperament. I think he really respected people who kept a cool head. I think he really valued people who he felt had integrity. He had very little time, I think, for people that he felt were deceiving him or deceiving others. But I think more than anything else, he also valued political courage. And I think in that role as UN Secretary General, I think he really realized that he had to be able to take risks. Otherwise, why have that job? And so I think time and time again, over those 10 years, he was willing to take risks when he had to. But at the same time, he had to manage all of these different relationships with key figures as well, and to be incredibly strategic in building up that political capital and trying to refresh that political capital so that he could stay on good terms with the big powers, as well as push these other agendas and be useful as a mediator as well. I think his Buddhism was important to him. It was something that he didn't talk about very much. He did talk about it to some extent, but not very much. And so I think some of the values, some of his ideas about the world came from that practice of Buddhism as well. But maybe more than anything else, it's that experience of coming from a small state that had been under the humiliation of colonial occupation, coming out of that. And he was interviewed, I think a few months after he retired as UN Secretary General. And they said to him, don't you think the world is a mess? And he said, yes, the world's a mess. You have the war in Vietnam, you have everything that has been happening in terms of the Nigerian civil war, the war over Bangladesh. But he said, when I was a young man in my 20s and 30s, we could never have imagined that within 20, 25 years, Burma would be independent and would be at an equal place at a table in New York, with this beautiful building on the East River, with the Americans, with the French and the British, setting up peacekeeping missions, talking about outer space exploration. If we can do that, imagine what we can do in another 25 years. So I think that spirit also came from this basic optimism. That having gone through war and colonialism, despite all the problems of the 1960s, which in some ways were even greater than the problems we have today, that optimism, that ambition from Bandung, especially later, was something that we did.
Let's talk about his risk-taking in the context of the Vietnam War. It's something he pushed all his life to end. And his president then, the US president at the time, was President Johnson, LBJ. You point out diplomatically that LBJ had only a limited interest in international affairs. U Thant himself was a lot less diplomatic and referred to it as juvenile in this regard. In particular, that LBJ said that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, the next target would be Hawaii. Take us through Thant's efforts to prevent escalation of and to end the Vietnam War.
I think if we go back to that year, 1964, he had just mediated, and in those days people still remember, he had mediated a de-escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was working well with the Americans on a whole host of different issues. He had excellent relations with John F. Kennedy. He had good relations in Moscow. So the UN, which looked like it might disappear in 1961, was on an even keel and set to do a lot, not just in mediations, but development as well. And I think he understood instinctively that if the Americans went to war in Vietnam, that would throw everything away. It would be a disaster for the Vietnamese, it would be a disaster for the United States, and it would be a disaster for the UN. And so he said to the Americans, he said to the Johnson administration in early 1964, or the summer of 1964. He said, if you go to war in Vietnam, you will lose. And this is something that Washington could never even come to contemplate, that this poor third world country could defeat them. He said, you will lose. He said, you have nothing to fear from a reunified Vietnam. They have no desire to come under Chinese or Soviet domination. And what you need is the help of the United Nations in finding a face-saving exit from Southeast Asia. And that was so much against the feeling at the time, because people like George Bundy, who here named after George Bundy and Dean Rusk and Robert McNamara, were saying at the time, if we bomb, the Vietnamese will negotiate on our terms. And we have to escalate. We have to bomb Vietnam. And the turning point was 1964. He actually secretly reached out through the Russians to the Vietnamese. And this is one of the great what-ifs of history, because Ho Chi Minh replied positively. It was a secret meeting with the Americans in Rangoon in late 1964. I'm pretty sure, and I've gone through all the archives on different sides, his side, also the American side, that Lyndon Johnson was not told by his own people who wanted that escalation. And by the time Lyndon Johnson was told, it was too late. The same day that that negative response went to Hanoi, the next day the Americans began probably 4 years of bombing. And then when it didn't happen the way the advisors had predicted, when after a couple of months of bombing, the Vietnamese hadn't caved in, the Americans landed the first batch of Marines at Da Nang in March of 1965. And that was the beginning of the war. And eventually, of course, the Americans and the Vietnamese agreed more or less on what U Thant had wanted them to agree in 64, but after many hundreds of thousands of people had died 8 or 9 years later.
It's a real missed opportunity, as it reads in your book. And he was also losing some of his allies. Obviously, President Kennedy had died. Adlai Stevenson, to whom he was close, died in 1965, and Nkrumah was overthrown in a coup. So there's a feeling that he doesn't have quite the same, maybe, connections and standing anymore. His public rhetoric got him into trouble with the US and with North Vietnam, mainly because I think by about 1967, when it was clear that this wasn't advancing, he talked publicly about his efforts in 1965. One of his aides advised him that maybe his real forte lay in framing the ways in which people thought about the war, in shifting public opinion. Did he shift public opinion about the war? We know public opinion in this country by 1967 was shifting.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, it's hard to quantify exactly what his impact was, but certainly he was one of the leaders of anti-war feeling in the United States on Vietnam. And he not only analyzed the war in a certain way by saying consistently and again, especially from 1966 onwards, that this is not about communism. This is not a war between communists who take over the world and those opposed to it. For the Vietnamese, this is a war of independence. This is part of their anti-colonial struggle. He went in 1967 to a meeting of 3,000 Quakers in South Carolina and compared the war in Vietnam to the American War of Independence, which Lyndon Johnson didn't like, and that was in the headlines of the New York Times. He put forward a very specific proposal on ending the war, which would begin with the unconditional halt of bombing of North Vietnam. And that was echoed by people from Martin Luther King until he was killed, to Robert Kennedy until he was killed, and many others in the late 1960s as well. So I think he was known not only for his analysis of the Vietnam War, but also for a very specific path that he laid out to a potential set of peace negotiations. But you mentioned Nkrumah's overthrow. And I think what's important to remember in the 60s was that this wasn't accidental. There was a deliberate effort to undermine that alternative world that was beginning to take shape. And if you think about Bandung and that vision that the African and Asian leaders had at that time for a world centered on the UN Charter, peace, development,
as part of the general reshaping of the world order. Over the 1960s, you saw one by one governments overthrown, from Indonesia to Sukarno in the mid-1960s, Nkrumah in the mid-1960s, many other coups, many other bloody interventions that basically undid that possibility of that world. And I think he felt by the late 1960s the ground moving from underneath him. That coalition of countries that had put him in office were no more. And in a way, by 1971, he was sort of the last man standing from that Bandung generation, literally on the 38th floor, a few hundred yards from here. Everybody else had either been radicalized because they were pushed in a certain direction from Ho Chi Minh to Fidel Castro in Cuba, or they'd been killed, or in the case of Nehru in India, had died. But he was the only one with that sort of moderate third world vision of a possible future at that time. And the Vietnam War was a huge part, I think, of moving in that direction.
There were some very harsh perceptions of the UN in the US. Lawrence Wright has written about how most people in Texas could not abide the United Nations, which stood for one worldism, which was communism. It stood for talk, not action. The Texas legislature passed a bill in 1963 making the display of the UN flag a crime. And he says nearly every car in the city with an impeach or warren bumper sticker boasted its companion, "Get us out of the UN." And I think this great hostility in the heartland is relevant to the blow U Thant was about to suffer over the Middle East. We really see the UN becoming the whipping boy for what happened in the Middle East. You want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, let me say just a word though on what you were saying before, which is that I think at the core of it, at the end of the day, the Americans were the principal architects of the UN. And there was enormous enthusiasm and support for the UN in the United States. I think what was difficult for many people was a world in which the US and the West would have to share power with the third world as it was emerging. And they just, I think people just could not get their heads around comfortable with that post-imperial world. And that is a tension that has run through global politics, but through UN politics, I think, ever since. And we're still in that moment of an unfinished kind of transition to a post-imperial system that is really resisted by many, that many don't feel comfortable with in accepting. I think in the Middle East, in '67, he was faced with an incredibly difficult set of decisions in the run-up to the Six-Day War. I think, having looked at this in the archives from many different directions, I think there were things that he could have done differently that could possibly, at a stretch, have prevented the Six-Day War. So I think one can fault him on very specific decisions that he didn't make at that time, and perhaps he should. That doesn't mean he was responsible for the war. Israel had decided to go to war by the third week of May. The Johnson administration had green-lighted the Israeli invasion of Egypt by that time. But still, as UN Secretary General, he didn't do what he did with the Cuban Missile Crisis in finding that possible path or that would have been possible. I think the main thing, though, is that after the Israeli, after the war, when Israel was occupying the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and Sinai, that he, in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 242, was consistent in pushing for a peace agreement that would include the full Israeli withdrawal from all the occupied territories. And that put him up against people both in the US, obviously some of the Israeli government as well, but also elsewhere, who felt that he was being too critical of, it's not so much too critical of Israel, but that he was not being sympathetic enough to Israel's position at that time. The inflection point was 1970, when an agreement was finally crafted, which would have included the full Israeli withdrawal from all the occupied territories, included Arab recognition of Israel, and a robust Security Council mandated peacekeeping force, including Soviet and American troops, that would have protected Israel's borders. And that was rejected in the end by Henry Kissinger, the Nixon White House. he felt very much at that time that that was an incredible opportunity. He became known and seen as someone who was very critical, not of Israel specifically, because there's a very interesting history as you read the book. He was actually a very close friend of Israel, a great leader, but very critical of that specific set of policies by Golda Meir's government at the time, but also by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger.
Do you think the fallout from that was a significant factor in the prestige of the Secretary General's office starting to decline, or was that more attributable to?
Yeah, I don't think it was a matter of the prestige of the Secretary General starting to decline, because I think, in a way, I think the thing that boosted the prestige of the office and the moral authority of the office was Vietnam. I think even though he hadn't been successful in stopping the war in Vietnam or mediating the end of the war in Vietnam, for the first time you had a UN Secretary General challenge the United States. And I think that, more than anything, kind of fueled the UN's prestige globally, or consolidated its moral authority in many different ways. I think that the UN, the way in which the UN was increasingly sidelined from many of the big global issues of the day by the early 1970s, was a very deliberate effort by the Nixon-Kissinger administration to move things in a different direction at that time. And there was a very deliberate, again, undermining of that alternative world in UN that could have come to be at that time. So it wasn't simply a kind of lessening of prestige, it was a deliberate effort to move things in a very different direction.
Nixon hosts a glittering dinner in 1970, at which Thant is, I think, guest of honor, and he doesn't mention any of Thant's great achievements, even as recently as 5 years before that, so it's quite striking. Much as I was dying to ask you about Thant's obsession with astrology and extraterrestrials, which is true, read the book,